Hello, welcome back again. This is our second lecture on social influence processes, and we're going to look at obedience, compliance, and social influence by groups. Throughout the lectures, you will find a number of inserted links to recommended reading and also short videos on the internet which illustrate the points that we are discussing. These are included because a number of the issues that we're going to cover have direct relevance to important social issues, and so I would like to illustrate how social psychology is relevant to our understanding of social life. So the first topic we're going to look at is the social psychology of obedience. Obedience, just like conformity, is much more common than we would usually like to believe, and very often we are not even conscious when we obey or when other people obey us. It's so much part of normal everyday social life. Obedience, just like conformity, is very useful in creating social structure. Obedience is the method when we produce behavioral change as a result of direct commands or direct instructions to another person. Obedience differs from conformity in that the pressure to conform is explicit, not implicit, and the source of the pressure is usually an individual, a leader, or a person on authority rather than the group as such. The classic experiment on obedience was carried out in the early 1960s by Stanley Milgram. The experiment was described to participants as a study in learning. Two people would turn up and the experimenter would then say, one of you will be the student and the other one will be the teacher. In fact, the student was a collaborator of Milgram and the teacher was the only genuine subject. The experiment involved the teacher asking the student to learn different word pairs, and every time the student makes a mistake, they were asked to deliver electric shocks on an increasing scale from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. The study was carried out first in a university setting and later also in a rundown downtown office building. Before doing the study, Milgram asked a number of behavioral scientists, psychologists and psychiatrists what did they think, whether the participants who were well-adjusted, normal, middle-class, middle-aged males would be willing to go as high as 450 volts in delivering these electric shocks. And all the behavioral experts said, no, this is not going to happen. Here are examples of pictures of participants in the study. For example, Mr. Wallace, who was one of the learners, who was hooked up to the electrical electrodes, where he would receive the electric shocks as a punishment every time he makes a mistake in the verbal learning task. The real participant is actually the teacher. The learner is a confederate of the experimenter. The experimenter explains the shock generator to the teacher. It looks like the equipment you see on the slide, and there are little switches that you can flick from 15 volts to 450 volts. 450 volts is clearly a lethal, deadly electric shock. This figure shows the results of the Milgram experiment. As you can see on the chart, 65% of all participants were totally obedient. In other words, they went all the way up to 450 volts in delivering electric shocks simply because the experimenter commanded them to do so. In other words, what the study demonstrates that it's sufficient for an authority figure to issue a command for people to behave in ways that would be totally unaccepted and which would be totally contrary to what the behavioral experts predicted. The electric shocks. Milgram describes their reactions like that. An initially poised businessman within 20 minutes was reduced to a twitching, shuddering wreck, approaching nervous collapse. At one point he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." and yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed to the end. In later experiments, Milgram was interested to explore what kinds of variables influence the degree of obedience. One thing he manipulated is the role of proximity or distance between the teacher and the learner. And he found that when the learner was sitting right next to the teacher rather than at the other side of a one-way screen, obedience reduced from 65% to 49%. In other words, when you are directly observing the suffering that you're inflicting on another person by obeying, people are less likely to obey. Interestingly though, even when the teacher was instructed to force the victim's hand on the electrode, still 30% obeyed. It's an extreme case of obedience. On the other hand, when the participants observed another participant refusing to obey, obedience collapsed to only about 10%. Of course, obedience is very common in everyday life. A social psychologist showed that even in the social psychology laboratory, participants are subject to extreme forces of obedience. Student participants, when given completely meaningless tasks to perform, nevertheless continue doing it and will obey until they are interrupted by the experimenter. The obedience research has raised a lot of interesting questions, some of them ethical. Is it justifiable to inflict the stress on the participants? The participants themselves claim, though, that even though the experiment was stressful, they really valued the experience and benefited from it. Other people question the methodological procedure used on the grounds that in this situation, the participants didn't really know what is going on. However, many obedience situations are just like that. You are told to do something and you do not fully understand all the circumstances and the conditions. So in that sense, the Milgram experiments tell us something very important about the human tendency to blindly obey, even when we are confused about the situation. Another variation in the Milgram experiment is changing the situation, the room where the experiment takes place. When it was carried out in a university, as we have seen, more than 60% obey. When Milgram repeated the same study in a rundown office building downtown, obedience to 450 words dropped to 48% only. And as we have seen before, exposure to another participant who obeys or doesn't obey has a significant effect. If the participant observes another subject, teacher, complying, obedience grows to 92%. Almost everybody goes along. If you see somebody who refuses, only 10% will go along. Of course, obedience is an extremely common occurrence in everyday life, and often we obey in situations which are quite similar to the Milgram experiment, in the sense that we don't fully know or understand the reason for the commands. Religious leaders, military leaders, organizations often issue commands. A good example of obedience is the recent government management of the COVID crisis, where we literally had regular commands about daily behavior, many of which were based on advice or reasons which we did not fully understand, but we followed them anyway. Now from obedience, we'll move on to another social influence process, compliance. This is something that's used in everyday life a great deal. Research on compliance is associated with the name of Robert Cialdini, a social psychologist who studied compliance method by taking on jobs as a salesperson in various companies. Studying the social influence strategies of salespeople, he argued that there are 6 basic principles of exerting social influence. Pretend friendship or liking can influence people. Try to get people to make a decision early, make a commitment which they usually stick to later on, even if the circumstances change. Appeals to scarcity, going fast, this is the last one, tends to persuade people to make a decision. Reciprocity, pretending to offer something in exchange, is an effective way of exerting social influence. Appealing to social validation, people like you or the group you belong to all behave this way. And finally, appealing to authority. Madonna or some other famous person has already bought one. These are some of the strategies that sales professionals use to achieve. One of the well-known compliance techniques demonstrated by Cialdini is the foot in the door technique. This is what happens when you start with a small request, which is likely to be accepted, and then you escalate to a larger one once the person showed themselves to be compliant. In the study by Friedman and Fraser, suburban householders were initially asked to put a huge "Drive carefully" sign in their front lawn, and of course almost everybody refused, only 17% agreed. The foot in the door technique had much more compliance. In this situation, householders were first asked to put a small 3-inch "Be a safe driver" sticker in their window, and after they have agreed to that, when they were next approached to put a large "Drive carefully" sign on their front lawn, now 76% agreed. In other words, prior agreement to a small request significantly increases the likelihood of agreeing to a larger, bigger request. Salesmen, door-to-door salesmen, often use this technique, asking householders first for a small favor. For example, can you give me a glass of water? And once they obtain compliance, they then ask a bigger favor, like, would you like to look at what I have to sell? Another technique is the lowballing technique, a compliance technique. This is the situation that used car salesmen often use. It involves obtaining acceptance first on a very favorable deal and then change the conditions to be much worse. For example, a used car salesman might offer you a wonderful deal on a car, and then 5 minutes later might come back and say, my sales manager doesn't approve it, I have to ask you for more money. It turns out that once people make an agreement, they tend to be consistent and carry out with the deal, even if it becomes much more disadvantageous. This was illustrated in an experiment by Cialdini and others in 1978, where participants were asked to get up at 7 a.m. and help with a particular task, and of course 76% refuse. However, if you first ask them to participate and 56% says yes, if you then change the conditions and say, okay, actually it will be at 7 a.m., now 95% will show up. So once you get agreement, it's much easier to obtain compliance even if the conditions change later. The door in the face technique is yet another manipulative technique where the persuasion professional first asks a large request, which is refused, and then follows up with a smaller request, the one that he was hoping for all along. For example, in this study by Cialdini in 1975, students are volunteered to agree to take kids to a 2-hour zoo visit. Only 17% agree, 83% refuse. However, if you turn it around and you first ask them to help for 2 hours a week for 2 years, nobody agrees. But if you then follow up with the more reasonable request to help for 2 hours to a zoo visit, now 50% agree. In other words, if you manipulate people to refuse a big request, they might feel guilty, and later on they are more willing to go along and agree to a smaller request. We can summarize these compliance strategies in terms of the participants need to remain consistent. The foot in the door technique involves asking a small favor, obtaining agreement, and then asking for a large favor, which otherwise would not have been complied with. The door-in-the-face strategy is the opposite. We ask for a large favor, it is declined, and then we ask for a smaller favor, which is more likely to be accepted, when in fact this was our objective all along. The lowball technique is when you get the participant to commit to a choice, and then you change the conditions of that choice to make it less advantageous, and many times in this situation the subject will continue to agree in order to remain consistent. Social influence strategies are often employed in the service of marketing and advertising. Many of these strategies exploit the universal human need for status and identity. Human beings lived in small, familiar, communal, face-to-face groups for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's a natural consequence of this evolutionary history that individuals have a deeply felt need to belong and to have a sense of identity and status. It is not coincidental that the breakdown of small communal society in the last 200 years and the emergence of highly individualistic societies where we no longer have so many meaningful group associations coincides with the emergence of consumerism. Please look at the very entertaining brief video, click on the link, that will tell you how consumerism emerged. For hundreds of thousands of years, most humans didn't possess anything than only the absolute necessities of survival. The idea that we can buy and accumulate material goods has really emerged in the late 18th century. But nowadays, the development of economic growth in Western societies is really driven by consumer demand. Modern marketing and advertising essentially is directed at exploiting the universal human need for status and identity as a result of the breakdown of meaningful social groups where status and identity would have been a natural part of being a group member. Whereas status and identity in traditional societies had to be earned and had to be accepted by members of the group, in modern industrial society we can buy products to indicate and signal our status and identity to ourselves and to others. So an argument could be made that consumerism, the purchase of goods and services, is driven by a psychological need rather than the actual utility of what people buy. It almost seems like consumers are being misled and behave irrationally, and advertising tends to exploit that social need. One evidence to back up this argument is many studies show that despite a huge increase in wealth and consumption over the last few decades, life satisfaction in many Western societies has not improved at all. In other words, people buy more and more goods, but they are not getting any happier as a result. Another line of evidence showing that consumption is often about psychological identity than utility is if you analyze the advertising that you see in the media. Most of the time, it is really appealing to the social needs and ideas of the consumer instead of emphasizing the actual value and quality of the product being sold. So what advertisers do is essentially selling an image and an identity, not the product itself. There are many examples of those kinds of brands which are essentially marketed in ways that emphasize the identity of the product and the purchaser rather than its necessary quality. Almost any brand name goods, not only luxury goods, but anything that's advertised has these characteristics. There are many products which are marketed mainly based on their value as status and identity symbols. Luxury cars are a good example. Many of the luxury German brands actually turn out to be less reliable on the surveys of the German Automobile Association compared to common brands such as Toyota, but people still buy them because of the social identity value that they convey. Designer labels, other brands, cosmetics are a particularly good example of a product that is sold on image and identity. Nutritional supplements are another example. Bottled water is an excellent illustration of how a product which is freely available from any tap can actually be sold and can become a multi-million-dollar industry by convincing people that the kind of water they drink says something important about them. Please make sure that you look at the two short videos about the marketing of bottled water. So the consumer advice is really simple. Ignore ads, buy on price and quality, and avoid advertised brands as far as possible. The next social influence strategy I'd like to talk about is the power of groups. Groups are immensely powerful influence agents. For most individuals, it is incredibly difficult to go against the pressure of a group in which they are already members. In order to understand social influence processes, and in particular the influence of groups on individuals, we need to take a historical and evolutionary perspective. For most of the 200,000 years of human evolution, human beings always lived in small, coercive, collective, face-to-face groups and societies, where you were born into a particular group and the accident of your birth probably determined your life chances forever after. Traditional societies were static, and for most of our 200,000 years of evolution, most human beings lived in a state of poverty, illness, suffering from war and violence, with high child mortality, and generally living a life which is very different from the life we live today. A revolutionary change occurred about 200 or 300 years ago when the idea that individuals could be liberated from the restrictions of the groups they are born into and might be able to make free choices, develop their options, and live the kind of life they want to, first emerged. The ideology of liberalism or individualism was a genuinely revolutionary change compared to the group-focused existence of our previous history. The ideology of individualism was rooted in the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the values of freedom, the development of science, humanism, and of course social changes such as industrialization. These developments produced an unprecedented growth in health, wealth, well-being, and tolerance. Compared to most of the earlier periods in human history, today we live in probably the best time ever to be alive. However, the tribal habits we acquired in our evolutionary past remain with us today. The attraction of group ideologies, group identity, and populist political systems remain ever present. So in a way, the amazing cultural and civilizational achievements of individualism are under permanent challenge from our more deeply seated collectivist group and tribal inclinations. Political movements like populism are still present today, as we have seen in the last few years, and present a danger to the survival of liberal society. The continuing power and universality of tribalism is nicely illustrated by a series of classic experiments by Henri Tajfel, who was at the University of Bristol in England. Tajfel carried out the so-called minimal group experiments, minimal group paradigms, where individuals were randomly assigned into two different groups. For example, people on one side of the lecture theatre would become group X, and people on the other side of the lecture theatre would become group Y. After this explicitly arbitrary and meaningless definition of the two groups, Tajfel asked students to make a simple decision allocating rewards, for example, money or lottery tickets, to two individuals about whom they didn't know anything except their group membership. So one of them was in group X, maybe your group, and the other one was in group Y. And what Tajfel found was that this completely superficial and meaningless group categorization was sufficient to produce an instant tendency to discriminate in favor of the in-group member. It seems like human beings, the moment they feel that they belong to a particular group, will spontaneously and without any rational reason benefit the whole group and tend to discriminate against the outgroup. Tajfel argued that one reason for that is that we seek to establish a positive identity by doing everything in our power to elevate the status of the in-group at the expense of any possible outgroup. Tajfel's experimental work showing that people are very willing to discriminate against outgroups even if they don't know anything about them was confirmed in empirical studies in public opinion surveys in some European countries. In these surveys, participants were asked to form an opinion about a group they never heard of, the Pirates. The studies showed that respondents are likely to have a negative opinion and negative attitudes towards the group, even though they don't know who they are, never heard of them, and actually the group doesn't even exist. What this shows is that there seems to be a very strong universal human tendency to think less well of outgroups and to improve the status of our in-group. The message of this research is that there are great dangers associated with emphasizing group identity because this can often lead to a tendency of forming tribal consensus and discriminating against others. Group conformity and group influence can have a major impact on how people think and how they see reality. We have already covered in the previous lecture the concept of consensual delusions, when a whole group of people, or sometimes a whole civilization, share beliefs which are not supported in any sense by reality. Witchcraft, human sacrifice, national, racial, ethnic and religious pride, violent utopistic ideologies such as fascism or Marxism or belief in personality cults are all examples of groups of people sharing a very strong belief in a fictional reality. These sort of shared beliefs have the benefit of reinforcing group identity and helping to integrate a group, but ultimately they may come into conflict with reality. The apparently very strong evolutionary tendency for humans to identify with an in-group and to discriminate against an out-group is also illustrated by human history. When we look at our past, tribal conflict between ethnic groups, religious groups, nation states seems to be the defining feature of our past. A good example is Europe in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, when for about 300 years, Protestants and Catholics in a religious war fought each other, resulting in the extermination of about 40% of the European population. It was perhaps at the end of this exhausting period of tribal conflict that the Enlightenment emerged as a new ideology that claimed that instead of tribal identification, each individual should be regarded as a self-sufficient, independent unit. The idea of universal humanism argued against the importance of tribal conflict. Steven Pinker at Harvard University argues that a significant reduction in violence in the last 200 or 300 years in Western civilization can be directly attributed to the invention of individualism and humanism as a counter to the tribal ideologies that humans are so willing to embrace in other times. The ability of groups to exercise powerful control over individuals is sometimes achieved by the mechanism of ostracism or exclusion. Being excluded from a group is perceived by people as incredibly painful, and some neuropsychological studies showed that ostracism influences the same brain areas where we would normally experience pain. The reason for the very powerful effects of ostracism are probably evolutionary. In our evolutionary history, being excluded from a group was probably the same as a death sentence. Individuals could not survive alone, only as members of a group. The term ostracism comes from the Greek. In ancient Greece, people were voting on who should be excluded from society, and they wrote the name of the person to be ostracized on broken bits of pottery called ostrakon, hence the name ostracism. There is an excellent short video by Kip Williams, who was at the University of New South Wales, who has done groundbreaking work on ostracism, explaining the concept and how it works. So I strongly recommend that you look at this video. The influence of groups can be very powerful on the thinking of individuals, even in modern contemporary societies. Recent research in the United States showed that believing in a group, being a member of a political party, was strongly linked to increased cognitive inflexibility. Partisan extremity was linked to rigidity in the thinking of individuals. Another study showed that partisans significantly overestimate the extremism of the opposing party. It is almost as if our tribal thinking functions to prepare us for battle. In other words, partisanship, group membership, tends to undermine our cognitive flexibility and makes it much more difficult to freely and openly communicate with other people and to express our opinions. Groups have a particularly important influence on the way people seek dignity and identity through group identification. Golec de Zavala, a Polish social psychologist, coined the term collective narcissism to describe the behavior and thinking of groups which seek to claim a kind of moral grandiosity, moral importance, especially when they lack sufficient self-confidence and have a victim mentality which they want to compensate for. Some countries in Europe, such as Poland or Hungary or Serbia, have been studied, and the tendency for collective narcissism has been documented. Another interesting aspect of seeking dignity and identity by group affiliation is the concept of cultural appropriation, the idea that if a particular group or culture invents a cultural product, it might be a dance, it might be folk art, it might be an invention, then that product is the property of that group and should not be used or appropriated by others. Of course, if you take this idea further, you could argue that inventions like the steam engine or electricity are the product of Western civilization, and by the same token, other civilizations should not appropriate these inventions. This principle clearly goes against the flow of human history, where every invention has been broadly disseminated across all of humanity, suggesting that we really all belong to the same group. You might want to look at Francis Fukuyama's video analyzing the importance of dignity and identity in history. What these examples illustrate is that tribal thinking and the influence of groups is extremely important in determining how people think about and represent reality. And this, of course, has major implications for political movements. we see many examples of group-based delusional ideologies functioning both on the political right and on the political left. On the right, ideologies like fascism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, racism have been very powerful ways of thinking, producing conflict. On the political left, ideologies such as Marxism, which explicitly demands class struggle, identity politics, wokeism, cancel culture, political correctness, are similarly collectivist identity group-based ideologies that suggest that group conflict is the way to engage in political action. These ideologies have some shared features. They are simple, they're close-minded, they assume a kind of moral absolutism, and their consequence is almost always intolerance. Please look at the link explaining how intolerance and populist ideologies are related. Extremes of group control often exploit the human tendency for tribal thinking and result in oppressive totalitarian regimes. Cults, religions, and sects sometimes show signs of totalitarianism, but typically populist political movements such as fascism, Marxism, or communism are responsible for the most dictatorial systems. The faces on this slide, Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, these are leaders of oppressive totalitarian movements, and they are responsible for the murder of literally many millions of people. Click on the link to find out which of them is the greatest mass murderer. Chinese concentration camps exist today as China is increasingly becoming a totalitarian country as well. I personally have some experience also of totalitarianism. I spent the first 20 years of my life in a totalitarian system. And if you're interested in my personal story, click on the last link on this page. I hope you'll find it interesting. One of the reasons why groups can have such a profound influence on our thinking is that human cognition is in a sense especially vulnerable to group-based information. Humans habitually rely on second-hand social information. In a word, we are pre-programmed to be gullible, and that can lead to consensual delusions. Humans seem to prefer simplicity, certainty, and absolutism in the information they receive, and we also suffer from what's called a confirmation bias, a tendency to selectively prefer information that confirms an existing belief system and to reject anything that violates it. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning social psychologist, identified two basic information processing systems characteristic of humans: System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is quick, heuristic, relies on second-hand information, and capitalizes on past experience. System 2 is slow, effortful, systematic, and analytical. Human beings typically prefer System 1 thinking, and this is the kind of thinking that makes it easy for group-based information to get preferential acceptance. This sort of information processing is different from what is assumed in Enlightenment values and ideology: rationality, analytic thinking, free speech and open exchange, respect for facts and truth. This kind of thinking requires System 2 information processing rather than System 1. Have a look at the two links which illustrate some of these points. It seems then that a tendency to accept second-hand information or information coming from groups is part of human nature, and this tendency, of course, is exploited in advertising, marketing, and politics. And even today in the 21st century, many people believe crazy belief systems which have absolutely no empirical support in truth: homeopathy, crystals, miracle cures, Chinese medicine, and one could continue the list. There are many examples of gullibility which you can see if you click on the next link. Another feature of human cognition is that almost anything to us can appear meaningful. The human brain is designed to form meanings even of meaningless information. You can illustrate this wonderful fact by clicking on the next link, the Derek Chopra bullshit generator. Derek Chopra is a New Age guru, and this website will randomly put together his words to generate, in fact, meaningless but apparently meaningful terms. What this illustrates is that almost anything can appear meaningful if you look at it and construct some meaning. The links on this slide speak to the question of human gullibility. Have a look at them. Now, all the work we surveyed so far indicates that groups can have a very powerful influence on human behavior, and some of this research has implications for some contemporary public issues. There are basically two ways in which we can approach social issues. We can emphasize universal individualism, the idea that individuals are the basic units of society, all humans belong to one single group, and every individual has universal and equal rights because we are all the same. Another ideological approach is emphasizing group identity. It argues that identity groups are the basic units of society. Individuals are not independent but are defined by their group identities, and so social problems have to be managed at the group identity level. Now, there are several issues with this group identity model that are important. The number of identity groups we can identify is potentially unlimited. We all belong to many different groups of identity. Secondly, emphasizing group identity has the tendency of reinforcing group categories and stereotypes and differences between us, which can be problematic, as we have seen in some of the earlier research. By dividing and creating different groups, the likelihood of conflict probably increases. This kind of social ideology has some of its roots in Marxist theory. Marxism explicitly predicts that social progress is basically promoted by group conflict. So if we want to make a better world, we have to identify different groups, and it's the conflict between those groups which produces positive outcomes. Have a look at the two videos here which illustrate two different approaches to this problem. Here are some brief examples of the two different models in action. The universalist human model emphasizes the idea that all humans belong to a single group, and Martin Luther King, the famous campaigner for emancipation, was a follower of this model. In his famous speech, he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." In other words, what Martin Luther King was advocating is a universal human rights principle where race no longer matters. Here is another example of the kind of universal human rights model based on individualism. The Dalai Lama said, "I am a Tibetan, I am Buddhist, and I am the Dalai Lama. But if I emphasize these differences, it sets me apart and raises barriers with other people. What we need to do is to pay more attention to the ways in which we are the same as other people rather than different." And finally, yet another example of the universalist individual human rights model. Pauli Murray, a civil rights campaigner, wrote the following: "I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all humankind." In other words, the avenue to social justice and human rights is by inclusiveness, by universal human rights principles. And here is an illustration of the second model that seeks social justice by dividing people into opposing groups. Intersectionality is a theory that argues that each person has multiple group memberships, and some of those memberships are privileged and others are oppressed. To resolve social justice, those who are oppressed have to fight against those who are privileged. On the top half of the figure, you see all the people who are claimed to be privileged: white, heterosexual, male, upper class, fertile, cisgender, able-bodied people, and there could be hundreds of more of those categories. At the bottom half of the figure are the groups which are considered to be oppressed: infertile, poor, female, non-white, gay, lesbian, transgender, and disabled people. And so the road to social justice and equality is a struggle between the oppressed against the oppressors. Social justice theories based on the group identity model necessarily imply that certain groups have to be excluded so that other groups can have a more equal and undisturbed experience. On this slide, you see an example from the New School of Social Research in New York, where special spaces are set aside for minority groups, and majority group members, for example, white males, are not allowed to enter because they are perceived as part of an opposing oppressive group. It is easy to see that this kind of policy that emphasizes group identity very easily can create division and potentially even hostility. Here is another slide illustrating the risks when we follow an intergroup conflict group identity model. Sarah Jong is a journalist at the New York Times, and this is an excerpt of her blog. She wrote, "Dumbass fucking white people marking up the internet with their opinions like dogs pissing on fire hydrants." And also, "Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men." It's quite easy to see that conflict is quite easily aroused when groups are defined in terms of their identities. Here is another example of the potential risks of group identity politics. This is an excerpt from a student newspaper at the Texas State University, where the article says, "Ontologically speaking, white death will mean liberation for all. Until then, remember this: I hate you because you shouldn't exist. You are both the dominant apparatus on the planet and the void in which all other cultures meeting you die." The point is that it is extremely easy to generate intergroup conflict by classifying people into different identity groups, just as the experiments by Henri Tajfel on the minimal group paradigm have shown. The kind of group influence and group conflicts we identified so far also occur on university campuses. In an interesting recent study at the University of Frankfurt, Rivers and Traunmüller found that on campus there is a degree of intolerance and taking offense at divergent views, which is now very common. Actually, many university students in Germany now actually favor restricting free speech. This sort of conformity pressures generated by identity groups produce interesting outcomes. For example, left-leaning students turn out to be less tolerant of free speech, whereas students on the right were found by Rivers and Traunmüller to be more likely to engage in self-censorship, especially on topics have to do with gender, immigration, or minorities. It's very interesting that universities, which should be the repository of free speech and open exchange, are now also showing signs of group influence and restriction of open exchange. Social influence exercised by groups basically works by engaging techniques to control the group mind. This includes intolerance for alternative views, control of speech and thought, sometimes goes under the label political correctness, and attempts to regulate language in order to change thinking. The two links on this slide refer to pieces which speak to the question of how language control is often a tool of group influence. Resisting group influence is also an important task for individuals. We need to look at viewpoint diversity and support heterodoxy and multiplicity of views, especially in universities. Associating mainly with like-minded people tends to make people more fallible and less correct. Our views, if they are to be correct, must be tested against our sharpest critics. We need to cultivate viewpoint diversity, and it's a very important rule for arguing with people who hold different views to actually make an effort to understand their points. One technique is to first restate your opponent's position to their satisfaction before making your own argument. Intolerance towards divergent views is a very dangerous practice in terms of social justice and social progress. So, to conclude, these lectures covered various mechanisms of social influence processes. We saw that human beings are highly social creatures, and our social nature has been shaped by evolutionary adaptations. Many of the social influence processes we described are universal across history and across culture. We conform to other people, partly because of normative social influence. We want to be accepted in a group, and partly because of informational social influence, because we accept the information from others as being valid and useful. These tendencies to conform are easily exploited for political and commercial purposes. The dangers of groupthink and consensual delusions are particularly severe. We need to recognize influence effects, and it's very important to safeguard individuality, autonomy, and tolerance for conflicting views against various influence effects. Have a look at the film on social influence processes, as well as the School of Life videos, which I'm attaching at the end of these slides again. I really hope that you enjoyed these lectures and perhaps learned something about the way social influence processes work in everyday life. I also would like to encourage you to read some of the books recommended on this page, and also to view the videos which are linked on the following pages. All the best for your studies.